Thank you for watching. My name is Glen Morgan, and this is another episode of We the Governed. And today we're going to be jumping into 5 stories that you might have missed this week, and it's the week of Thanksgiving, so it's very likely you missed some of these stories just because you're probably getting ready for the holidays. So let's just jump right into it because I think these are interesting, and you will be interested as well. So one of the things we always know, of course, in Washington State is we do have our dear leader, Bob Ferguson, who has plans for us, and most of those plans aren't very good unless you're a political insider and you're going to get some benefit from getting part of the grift. But of course, Bob Ferguson's only going to want you to know the stories that he narrates from his office, assuming he's in Olympia, which isn't very often. So let's just get into some of these things right away. And before we start those stories, if you haven't hit the like and subscribe button down below, please do so at your earliest convenience. The more we do that and share these stories with others, the better off this channel does, the more we can bypass the efforts that Bob Ferguson implements to try to prevent the rest of us from hearing the stories that he doesn't want us to know. So let's just jump right into it. The number 5 on our list today is going to be I See Ice Ice Baby and I Want to Blow the Whistle. This was really a story that comes out of Vancouver, and it really has more to do with just this silly thing about form a crowd, stay loud, giving away free whistles, 3D printed whistles at White Oak Brooks, which is Book's Place. It's just a store down in Vancouver. But of course, it's everywhere. This kind of is part of the invasion from Portland a little bit. And if there's one thing that we have seen is that the paranoia about ICE and the desire to protect violent criminals and drug cartels in Washington State is definitely requiring people to virtue signal with their rainbow whistles as much as they possibly can, because that's certain to deter any effort that Trump might have to get rid of violent illegal criminals who are here in our state illegally. But it's an interesting story, and I just thought you might be amused. Moving on to number 4. Number 4 really is a much more serious story, which has to do with the president of Microsoft coming out and openly saying that these new Washington taxes are going to drive companies out of Washington State. And he was also pointing out that even Vancouver, BC is winning from Washington State stupidity. Now, what's an interesting part of the story is that people have to realize these people who run large corporations don't want to really involve themselves in the political process like this. And in Washington State, that usually means if you're going to criticize anybody, you should be criticizing Republicans so that you'd feel better at the wine and cheese clubs, and it'd be easier when you're lobbying in Olympia to get your special kickbacks and insider deals. So to see somebody from a major corporation actually come out in Washington State and openly and publicly explain how destructive these tax policies are to the business climate of Washington is actually saying something, and it's not a common thing. I don't see this very often in our state. Now, when you really look at some of the jobs that have gone down the drain in Washington State lately, especially those in the Puget Sound area, we're talking about Microsoft laying off 3,200 local jobs. We're talking about Amazon cutting 2,300 local jobs. These are mostly high-paying jobs. Meta, Oracle, Salesforce, these all have been cutting the local headcount, mostly in the Puget Sound area. But they're not alone. Verizon, IBM, Boeing, there's a lot of layoffs, actually, that have been going on in Washington State, and it's been concentrated in Washington State compared to other states. One of the places you can go and look for this is it's a website called warntracker.com, and it's actually just uses public records to track public notices of layoffs. So it's not comprehensive, of course, but just this year there have been 55,770 announced layoffs of employees in Washington State. Only California had more laid off than our state. In fact, we're right ahead of Texas and Georgia, the closest ones to us, which were at 22,000 and 28,000 in the same time. Now, obviously, more people lose their jobs than are just announcing these layoffs, but this is fairly significant. It's kind of a big deal, and it's something that people need to be aware of. Now, will our dear leader, Bob Ferguson, actually have second thoughts about the stupid tax increases that he signed so enthusiastically earlier this year and that, frankly, aren't producing the results that he thought they were? Well, I don't think so, but nevertheless, it'd be nice to dream. Let's move on to story number 3 that you might have missed. Now, this one is also, I think, fairly serious, although it's more of a warning that if the right things line up. There was a story on Center Square, an interview of an expert on Washington State's power grid in general, and he's warning that Washington State is, for the first time, starting to inch closer to being at risk of blackouts if we have any real serious cold weather this year. This was also reiterated by my friend Todd Myers from the Washington Policy Center here, being interviewed on the John Curley Show just a few days ago, also talking about the same issue. When you really look at it, though, what they're really talking about is the fact that Washington State has a couple of benefits with our local energy policy. The biggest thing that saves our state, and always has, when it's at least since we've cared about electricity, is the fact that most of our power comes from hydropower in the state. That's a bonus. Hydropower actually exists when you have rain, and gravity has not disappeared, and it is a significant generator. Over 66% or so of the power in Washington State comes from hydro. However, Washington State's been destroying some of the other base load power, the power that pretty much can run on call all the time, like natural gas or coal. For instance, near me, the TransAlta Centralia plant is being shut down, not because there's anything wrong with it, but that's because the state legislature and the Democrats have been aggressively targeting any power plants that they can shut down in Washington State using any excuse they can find. And TransAlta, of course, was top of the list. That goes offline this year. And the problem is what's replacing it, if it's being replaced at all, are windmills that dot the fruited plain of Washington State, like these over on the Palouse. The problem with this is that, of course, when we do have very strong cold weather, or it's at night and the solar panels aren't going to work, the cold weather tends to not generate a lot of wind. That's typically what happens when you get these cold weather snaps that come in, and the base load power is starting to reach the point where it may not be able to keep up with the Washington State's power needs, which means you may have rolling blackouts in Washington, which haven't happened for a long, long time. Not since they put the dams in. We used to be a power exporter. We're actually reaching the point where we may not even have enough power for our state under certain emergency situations. Now, many of you that have watched my channel over the years, you know I've done stories about the power grid risks that we run, not just in our state, but elsewhere. And most of those have been tied around the potential for sabotage and bad behavior, but and also sometimes on political stupidity. This is really more a story that you might have missed as kind of a slow motion train wreck related to the stupidity of the power grid approach that our political leadership's taken in Washington State. But I do think it's one that matters, and it's one we should be paying attention to, and you might have missed it. Story number 2. Now, this story really comes to us again as more of a silly story where, if you remember, right, this guy right here was actually had broken into the state capitol a while ago and started a fire. But of course, since he's a Democrat, nobody wanted to charge him with arson, which is absurd, but that's what happened. And so I've linked to some of these stories down below if you want to kind of get a refresher. But nevertheless, here's this guy. He breaks into the state capitol, smashes his way in, tries to start multiple fires, and gets arrested. In about 15 minutes, he did quite a bit of damage. And remember, it was exposed previously by a number of people that he had actually been the volunteer sergeant at arms, the Washington State Democrat Convention in 2024. Former graduate Thomas Jefferson, just like me, in Federal Way, and also a professional baseball player, which I definitely was not, and a very good athlete who came back and he's gone crazy. And of course, nothing demonstrates craziness more than being Sergeant of Arms at the State Democrat Party convention, where, of course, one of the things people are wondering is just how crazy did these people make him, with Shasti Conrad here with her good leader at the time. Unfortunately, now that this guy's been set free and he's going to have some kind of a show trial in the future, one of the questions is how much damage did he really do? And we just had the announced article that came out, Shayla's Chronicle. It looks like it's going to be between $600,000 and $1 million worth of damage with this guy's shenanigans. And although they're refusing to call him an arsonist since he's Democrat, and after all, he just broke in the state capitol and tried to burn it down, so that couldn't possibly be arson. And but I'll tell you what, it's going to be a very steep bill for the taxpayers for this guy's 15 minutes of fame. And the other question, of course, he's certainly wondering is exactly what do I have to do to get any kind of prison time around here? It's a question that none of us seem to be able to answer. Moving on to story number 1. This is the story that I think is also going to be missed by a lot of people, and I think it's pretty interesting. And this really comes out of Bellevue. Bellevue recently made some significant announcements with the police department there saying they're very explicitly going to be cracking down on theft, retail theft, shoplifting, things like that as holiday shopping begins. Now, this is kind of important, and normally this wouldn't really merit much of a story, except that if you paid attention to what's going on in Bellevue, they have been able to drop shoplifting by 22% this year compared to last year, but they did have to make some arrests, 630 of them so far, according to the article, by the Bellevue Police Department of people who think that it's okay to shoplift in Seattle, or I should say in Bellevue, just like they do every day in Seattle. It is not. Bellevue seems to be willing to arrest and charge and put people in jail for committing crimes like this. And they started doing this really aggressively over the last couple of years. I remember when they arrested 160 people last year in Bellevue for shoplifting. That seems to be a shock since a lot of these people had come from Renton or other places around Washington State thinking they could get away with it in Bellevue, and that has not been the case, which is a big contrast to the new mayor that's just been elected in Seattle, right across the lake on that floating bridge, who's basically elected as a socialist and who plans to drain the coffers dry, drain the taxpayers dry, and turn Seattle into the socialist utopian experiment that you know it has always wanted to be. And that is, of course, where shoplifting is encouraged and continues unabated right now, all the time, all over the place. It is very difficult, if not impossible, to get arrested for shoplifting in Seattle. And this new mayor seems to think that that's just great. So that's the stories. Those are 5 stories I think you might have missed. Washington State is a beautiful place, even if our politicians are not. I think it's always important to remember that. You shouldn't attach your happiness or joy based on who the politicians are, because they really won't. It's not the agency or salvation as much as the ability to create great harm, while the rest of the state continues as it always has. Now, the problem is, of course, that politicians can damage and hurt us, and our current political class seems determined to do so. But this is a trend that does happen over time, and I do believe that if we want to make the difference and change things, then we need to show up and push back. But I hope you appreciated the 5 stories that I showed to you today, reported today, and let me know if you think there's any other stories I might have missed in the comments section down below. And until then, enjoy your Thanksgiving, and we will talk to you next time.